Hi everyone, my name is Molly Smith, and today I will be discussing the core vocabulary approach as a treatment for inconsistent speech disorder. So, to begin, here is a brief overview of the topics that we will be covering today in relation to the core vocabulary approach. We will start with an introduction to the approach, after which we will review a research article that assesses the implementation of core vocabulary approach. We will then discuss the details of the intervention process. We will go over a sample goal and objectives for a mock client. We will discuss an optional intervention activity and materials that could be used to implement this approach. And we will also cover some resources for parents or clients that are using this core vocabulary approach. So these learning objectives break down what you can expect to learn about the core vocabulary approach during this presentation. First, you will gain an understanding of some of the empirical research that's performed to assess the use of core vocabulary approach in the clinical setting, and you will learn about the efficacy of the intervention. You will also learn about why and for whom the core vocabulary approach is used and how this type of intervention is implemented, including establishing goals and objectives for a client. And you will also have an opportunity to see a sample activity for implementing this approach in a clinical setting, with example materials and suggestions for data collection, as well as ways to support a client during the intervention process. So really overall, we're looking at research, learning about the purpose and procedures of the intervention, and then some clinical examples. Just to introduce us to the core vocabulary approach a little bit before we get started, the simplest explanation for the core vocabulary approach is that it targets production of a list of predetermined words with the goal of improving a child's consistency in production of those words. The core vocabulary approach is important to intervention for speech sound disorders because it has been shown to improve speech production in children with inconsistent speech disorders. ISD, which is also known as inconsistent phonological disorder, is a type of speech sound disorder that's characterized by inconsistency in word production. Children with ISD speak with a high proportion of differing productions of the same words, and they make multiple error types at both the phonemic and the syllable level. However, they do not typically exhibit groping behaviors, and they're usually stimulable for their errors that they made during spontaneous production, which are some of the key factors that differentiate these children from those that are diagnosed with childhood apraxia of speech. Children with inconsistent speech disorder have speech errors that are often not remediated by other contrast therapies like minimal pairs or multiple oppositions approaches. So this intervention, the core vocabulary approach, is really valuable for this specific population of children. We will begin our more in-depth discussion of the core vocabulary approach with a review of the research article titled Evaluation of Core Vocabulary Intervention for Treatment of Inconsistent Phonological Disorder, 3 Treatment Case Studies. This was completed by Beth McIntosh and Barbara Dodd. And this study, which was published in the journal Child Language Teaching and Therapy in 2009, assessed the effects of core vocabulary intervention for 3 boys with inconsistent speech disorder. So first, we're going to go over the purpose and the research questions for this article. The purpose of this study was just really to assess the effectiveness of the core vocabulary approach at improving both the accuracy of speech and consistency of speech in children with inconsistent speech disorder. Additionally, authors McIntosh and Dodd wanted to determine the effect of this intervention on overall intelligibility, which they assessed through measures like percent consonants correct, percent vowels correct, and single word versus connected speech agreement. They also wanted to assess generalization of correct phoneme productions to untreated probe words as well. The purposes of this study are really reflected in the research questions that the authors posed. First, how effective is the core vocabulary approach at remediating ISD? Second, does remediation to the inconsistency remain or even improve post-therapy? And last, how do individual differences in temperament, behavior, exposure to past therapy, or use of default word plans impact the intervention's success in treating inconsistent speech disorders? So these are all things that the authors were looking to answer as they conducted this study. This research included intervention case studies for 3 young boys. Their names were Andrew, Ben, and Cameron. Before we get into the details of their differences, first, it's important to note that all boys were assessed and had normal oromotor abilities with no signs of groping, and they were successfully stimulable for sounds that were produced incorrectly during spontaneous speech, which suggests that none of the boys are suffering from childhood apraxia of speech. However, each boy also had an inconsistency score above 40% and were therefore deemed to have inconsistent speech disorder. Now, if we take a look at Andrew, whose profile is on the far left, Andrew was the youngest of the participants at 3 years and 8 months old, and he was also the only child to have received previous speech intervention. He had previously received 10 sessions of minimal pairs intervention, but that intervention had little effect on his speech production, and Andrew was scored with an inconsistency of 56%. Ben, in the center there, was 3 years and 9 months old during this study. He had a habit of using default word plans for many of his word productions, and most words were made as 2 syllables with final consonants deleted, and often words were ended with a schwa. Despite this use of a default plan, Ben was still producing many inconsistent errors in his speech and had an inconsistency score of 64%. Lastly, Cameron on the right was the oldest of the participants at 4 years and 2 months old. His mother reported significantly low intelligibility and that Cameron had high levels of frustration at his inability to communicate effectively. Unlike the other 2 participants, Cameron's speech difficulties led to behavior issues such as reluctance to try new words and avoidance tactics like running away or hiding under furniture during therapy and practice at home. Cameron had an inconsistency score of 64%. Each boy had unique circumstances or problems that differentiated them from the other participants, and McIntosh and Dodd hoped to determine how these differences might impact each boy's success with the core vocabulary approach. So here is just a breakdown of the procedure that the authors went through as they implemented this study. Before therapy began, the parents of each child were asked to compile a list of 50 words minimum that were functionally powerful to the boys, meaning they were words that were frequently part of the child's vocabulary and would be useful words to increase consistency of production. These word lists often included names of the boys' family and friends, some of their favorite toys, foods, or games, and functionally important words like sorry, please, or done. The boys were seen twice a week for between 30 and 40 minutes for each session. During the first session of the week, they were taught some of the words from their list. The goal of the first session was really to establish saying the words consistently with the best possible production. And this is really important here because this did not mean that the word had to be said perfectly in its adult form, but that the production was reasonable and age appropriate for the child. The number of words that were targeted per week varied and depended on the child's ability to achieve the best possible word production for their targets. So when they began, the 3 boys were really only working on about 4 to 5 words per week, but by the end, they had increased to between 6 and 12 words, depending on their success. The second session of the week focused on drilling best production of the target words that had been chosen for that week, in order to ensure consistency in their production. Ideally, during this session, the boys would produce no less than 20 repetitions of consistent production of each of the target words for that week. At the end of the session, they were then asked to produce their target words 3 more times each. If they were successful with a word for all 3 productions, it was considered finished and removed from the set, and if not, the word was carried over to the following week to continue practice. Throughout the week, the parents also provided their children with opportunities at home to practice their target words in order to ensure that best production was being drilled every day, even when the kids were not at therapy. Additionally, once every 8 weeks, probe words were used, these are untreated words, to monitor for generalization and increases in consistency of speech production. So here are the results. We'll cover the kind of 3 key general results first, and then we'll look at some of the individual data for the boys. So on the left here, you can see the general results. Although the participants in this study had varying levels of success, it's important to note that all 3 boys saw at least some remediation of their inconsistent speech disorder. So the 3 main results from the study are as follows. All participants saw an increase in their percent consonants correct, percent vowels correct, percent phonemes correct, and ratio of single word versus continued speech production. They also all experienced a decrease in inconsistency during speech production. Lastly, all 3 participants showed maintenance of their progress across all measured categories, even when they were reassessed post-therapy between 8 weeks and 4 months after stopping therapy. And many of them even saw improvements in some of those scores. Now, taking a look at individual data, you can see that Andrew on the right-hand side completed 12 sessions and 53 word targets. During that time, he was able to reduce his inconsistency score from 56% all the way down to 10%. Ben completed 27 sessions and 86 target words, and at the end of his therapy, he had reduced his inconsistency score from 64% all the way down to 10%. Cameron completed 23 sessions and 81 target words. He had the most difficulty during therapy, and he was only able to reduce his inconsistency score from 64% down to 40%. So although he is still considered to have inconsistent speech disorder because he's falling at that 40% mark, his parents report that his intelligibility is much improved. So the most significant takeaway from McIntosh and Dodd's research, as was previously mentioned, is simply that the core vocabulary approach is effective at remediating inconsistent speech disorder. Even though progress was varied between the clients, all participants had positive outcomes from the intervention. Here are 3 other key points that were addressed in the article as well. First, results of this study highlight that the type of therapy used has a significant effect on the success of the intervention. Andrew is a great example of this. His previous lack of progress with the oppositional approaches like minimal pairs therapy and traditional articulation therapy are starkly contrasted with the significant progress he displayed when using the core vocabulary approach. These results really underscore the need for intervention that targets planning the sequencing of phonemes in words for children with inconsistent speech disorder. Second, children with ISD who use default word plans might need creative solutions to disrupt this pattern and rearrange their word production to reach best production during therapy. So Ben is a great example of a child who has these standard word plans. He had a very pervasive default word plan and preferred word shape that were just not being suppressed during initial therapy sessions. His therapy required kind of intermediate steps in which the words from his list were adjusted and additional allowable productions were accepted. For example, he took the word good and produced goody, or shop and produced shopping, adding those extra sounds on the end to more easily disrupt his word plan. Upon mastery of these word adjustments, it was a lot easier for Ben to simply move to a single syllable word with the best production achieved. So it's clear that some children may need additional steps in the process and flexibility of allowable word productions before they're really able to say consistently the best production of the target words on their list. And lastly, Cameron's case really highlighted the impact that behavior problems can have on successful remediation of a disorder. So Cameron's course of therapy was lengthened more than expected, largely due to his avoidance strategies that decreased progress and limited his practice with target words both in the clinic and at home as well. Core vocabulary intervention really relies heavily on the idea of drilling target words to ensure consistency and success, and Cameron's frequent refusal notably inhibited his progress towards remediation. Overall, there's a clear link between both low intelligibility and behavior problems, as well as a link between behavior problems and disruptions to remediation. So, the conclusions, main takeaways from this article, the authors concluded that in order for interventions to be impactful, they really need to be selected based on the specific needs of the child rather than general assumptions about their speech errors. Additionally, children with speech sound disorders are unique and they often need accommodations and adjustments during therapy in order to make the process accessible and the goals achievable. Ultimately, the core vocabulary approach that focuses on the planning of whole words improved participants' inconsistent speech disorder, as evidenced by their reduced inconsistency of speech, which was maintained post-therapy. Okay, we are now going to move on to discuss the details of the intervention for core vocabulary approach. So let's begin with the official definition for core vocabulary approach. According to the American Speech and Hearing Association, the core vocabulary approach is defined as an intervention that focuses on whole word production and is used for children with inconsistent speech sound production. Words selected for practice are those used frequently in the child's functional communication. A list of frequently used words is developed, e.g. based on observation, parent report, and/or teacher report, and a number of words from this list are selected each week for treatment. The child is taught his or her best word production, and the words are practiced until consistently produced. So, to go over the population and kind of the goals, let's just get into the details here of intervention. The intended population for the core vocabulary approach is children with inconsistent speech disorder. In particular, this approach is really useful and valuable for those clients who are not responsive to more standard speech sound disorder treatments like traditional articulation therapy or contrast treatments like minimal pairs or multiple oppositions. The goal of intervention with the core vocabulary approach is to improve consistency of production for a set of words. The focus here, really important, is on consistency. A child may not produce the correct adult version of a target word. However, if their production is consistent and appropriate, that is what is most important. Each child will have best productions of words that are unique to them, and this production is what the child should be working to replicate along with the support of the therapist and their parents. As the child becomes more consistent with their speech, the result is increased intelligibility. Eventually, the hope is that this increased intelligibility, this increased in consistency and production of the treated words will lead to increased consistency across all words in the child's vocabulary. So here is a breakdown of the steps for using the core vocabulary intervention. First, parents and teachers should be working together to create a large list of words, typically 50 to 70 of them, that are functionally relevant for the child. These should be words that the child uses often at home or at school, words the child is interested in, or that are grammatically or pragmatically necessary for the child to know and be able to produce successfully. Next, the SLP selects 10 words to train in the first session of the week with the client. So they'll meet with the client twice during the first session. They've got 10 words that they are training and teaching the child to produce. The SLP needs to work on establishing a best production of the 10 words that reflects the most correct way of saying the word that the child can accomplish. It's okay if the adult model of the word is not what they're saying, as long as it's a good approximation of the word and the production is consistent. Then, step 3, the client practices the 10 target words with their SLP during their appointment and also with their parents and teacher throughout the week at home and at school. Parents and teachers are really, really valuable agents of change who can make a significant difference in the effectiveness of the core vocabulary approach. The more persistent that they are with drilling the target words and working to ensure consistent productions, the greater the chance for success and remediation of inconsistent speech disorder. So, step 4, at the end of the week, when the client meets with the SLP once more, they will work through an activity or a game and begin with just drilling the target words again. After this, the SLP assesses their progress by having the child repeat each word in their list 3 more times. If the client is able to produce any of those words with consistency in those 3 times, those words are removed from the list of 10 targets. Step 5, new words are chosen for the following week's intervention from that original list of 50 to 70 words, and those words replace the old ones that were removed. Any words that were not mastered from the previous week remain on the list for continued practice the following week. And lastly, step 6, every few weeks, the SLP will choose 10 untreated probe words from that list of 50 to 70 words. So these are words that the child has not been exposed to, not had instruction on production with yet. The SLP chooses those words, and they elicit these words 3 times with the client to monitor for any generalization. So here is an example of what a goal could look like to accompany the core vocabulary approach for a client with ISD who has particularly pervasive inconsistencies in their production of the fricatives S, Z, F, and V. So the goal reads, by October 31st, 2022, client will decrease inconsistent production of fricative sounds S, Z, F, and V from 50% to 20% given picture stimulus in 10 trials with 90% accuracy across 2 consecutive sessions as measured by charted data and therapy notes. So essentially what this goal is saying for this client is that they want to have a 20% inconsistency score. That means they're only inconsistently producing the target 20% of the time across 10 trials of target word production with 90% accuracy, meaning that they are achieving this inconsistency score of 20% for at least 9 out of those 10 trials. That is this ultimate goal for this child to reach. And here is an example of 2 objectives for this goal. So objective 1 reads, by August 31st, 2022, client will decrease inconsistent production of fricative sounds S, Z, F, and V from 50% to 40% given picture stimulus in 10 trials with 70% accuracy across 2 consecutive sessions as measured by charted data and therapy notes. Then we have our second objective. By September 30th, 2022, client will decrease inconsistent production of fricative sounds S, Z, F, and V from 40% to 30% given picture stimulus in 10 trials with 80% accuracy across 2 consecutive sessions as measured by charted data and therapy notes. So what's important to note here is that the objectives are really highlighting the progress of both reducing the percentage of inconsistency. So we started at 50%, we worked slowly down to 40%, and then 30% with, again, remember the ultimate goal of being down to 20%. The objectives also work to increase the client's accuracy. So beginning with objective 1, the accuracy goal is 70%, and that's increased to 80% accuracy for objective 2. And you'll recall that the ultimate goal's accuracy, desired accuracy level, was 90%. So we are now going to delve into an example of an intervention activity that could be completed with a client while using the core vocabulary approach to work on remediating inconsistent speech disorder. So in this activity example, the client will play Candyland with the SLP. During the game, the client must complete 10 productions of one of the target words before taking their turn. The goal of this activity is really just to produce extensive drilling of the target words, but hopefully in a way that's engaging and fun for the client so that they're staying focused and continuing to work on that consistent word production. Really, any board game or any kind of fun activity will work for this client, for a client. The most important thing is that you're choosing something that they're excited to do or play, and this will help motivate them to attempt productions of their target words so that they can take a turn or do the move, whatever it is. Core vocabulary intervention is really, really heavily drill based, so it's important that the SLP finds an activity that engages the client and holds their attention to ensure that they're practicing the target words. So for this activity, here is the example materials that you're going to need. These are the materials you must have in order to be able to carry out this activity. You will need Candyland, the board game, but recall any game will suffice as long as it has turn taking or the ability to kind of break it down into steps to intersperse with producing the targeted words. So in addition to the board game or whatever the activity that you choose is, you will also need a scoring sheet to mark down the client's consistent versus inconsistent productions. And you can see this sheet here as well. It's really small, but you'll see it bigger in a couple slides. And lastly, you also will want to have your picture prompt cards for the client's 10 target words for that week. And you can see the picture prompt cards are on the bottom. So for our sample client here, you'll recall they were working on the S, Z, F, and V sounds. So they've got the words there. Their list is sister, family, phone, frog, juice, house, leaves, please, van, and school. So we would have all 10 of those picture cards there for the client as well. And here are some additional optional materials. Just, as I mentioned, you don't have to play Candyland. You can really do any kind of game or activity. You could do something like other classic games like Chutes and Ladders or Play Memory. You could do a more hands-on game like Let's Go Fishing or Build Mr. Potato Head, where they have to do 10 successful productions before they can fish for a fish or spin for an item to put on Mr. Potato Head. Or you could even do a craft or drawing activity like tic-tac-toe or the cut and glue rocket, where you would need also glue and scissors. Any of these work. You just have to be able to also include the 10 targeted productions in between each quote-unquote turn that the child is taking so that they're motivated and engaged. The basic idea really stays the same. Before the client takes a turn or completes part of the craft or the activity, they just need to produce the 10 repetitions of the target word that they drew from their weekly set of words. So here is what the procedure would look like for this example intervention activity. To begin the session, before you start the game or the activity, you just need to review the best production of the 10 target words with the client. So this is not a test. You're not trying to take any data here. You just want to review how the words are produced with the client. And you will have them produce each word 3 times. So you can see again the word list shown on the screen there. The client would produce each of those words 3 times using the best production that the SLP had taught them earlier that week. Then you could review the rules of the game. So in our case with Candyland, you would review the rules for how to play Candyland, and you would also explain that before the child takes their turn, they have to produce 1 target word. So they would draw a word, one of the cards from the pile, and they have to produce that target word with their best production, or do their best at producing the best production 10 times. If they do 10 consistent productions, they make no errors, then they can move an extra space. And that reward can be adjusted depending on the activity that you're doing. Now you can begin the game. So as you begin, like I said, the client draws a target word from the deck of picture cards. So for example, let's say the client chose the word school. The client then needs to make 10 attempts at best production of the word school. And it's important to remember that it might not mean that they're producing it school. Maybe it's skua, and that's how you and the client came up with best production for them that was age appropriate and understandable and consistent using that vowelization process. If this is the best production that was determined, it's okay. The important thing is that they are consistently using that production every time. So after they've drawn that card from the deck, they say the word school using their best production, make 10 attempts. Then that card is put to the side until all the rest of the cards are also cycled through. So we want to make sure we're hitting every card in the deck before we put them all back in. Once every card has been drawn from the stack of 10, then they can all be shuffled and put back into one stack. So after they say their 10 productions, they do their best to imitate the best production as consistently as they can. The SLP will record consistent versus inconsistent productions, and be sure to provide feedback for the errors that they're making as soon as the child makes those errors. Once the productions are done, the client can take their turn at the game, and then the SLP goes. And this process is repeated until all the target words are attempted across 5 trials. So they're attempted 10 times across 5 different trials. That's a lot of times to drill, and drilling really needs to be happening a lot during these sessions, and it's pretty likely that you may need to play a different game or play this game multiple times. Whatever the process is, if you switch games, if you start over again, the procedure should be maintained. Now, to wrap up the sessions, you will ask the client to produce each target word 3 times now that the session is over. Go through the list, pull out each word one at a time, and ask the client to say it 3 times. If they have 3 consistent productions of the word without fail, that word can be removed from the set. If they're still having inconsistent productions of the word, then the word is retained. Afterwards, you will select new words to replace those, so new words from that list of 50 to 70 to replace the ones that they completed. And then, after the first session the following week, review the new group of 10 target words with the parents, including best productions of each word for the child, so that they can drill these words with them at home. So here is how gathering data would look for an activity like this. First, the SLP needs to establish what the goal inconsistency level of production is for this session. So if you'll remember way back to our goal example, ultimately, the goal was for the client by the end of all of the intervention to get down to 20% inconsistency, but they're not going to be there right away. So during the weekly interventions, the SLP needs to establish what is the goal inconsistency percentage going to be for this session. This number will be based on the goal and the objectives that are in place for the client. So with our mock client, if you'll recall, their first objective is just to decrease the 50% inconsistency down to 40%. So we will use that value, that 40%, for this example session, and we'll consider any trials that have 40% or less inconsistency to be a success and count that towards their accuracy count. So the only thing that needs to be actively marked during the session with the client is a plus or a minus to note consistent or inconsistent production of the target word. All the calculations and determining inconsistency percentages and accuracy percentages, that can all be done after the client has left. Really, the main focus needs to be on attending to the client and giving them feedback for any errors that are made promptly and effectively. For each word, like I said, you're going to mark a plus or a minus to indicate the child's consistent or inconsistent productions of the word in each trial. And by the end of the session, the client should have attempted 5 trials with 10 productions each for all 10 of the words. For each trial, then, you would count the number of inconsistent productions of the word and note that number out of 10 in the associated box, and then write the percent inconsistency for that trial. And this will be easier to see. I have an example on the next slide that we will go over. So after you've done that, you will look across trials 1 through 5 and count how many times the client successfully produced their target words with an inconsistency score at 40% or below, because remember that 40% was our goal for this session specifically. You'll write down the total number of trials where this was achieved out of 5 in the far right column, and that is the client's percent accuracy for that specific word, given the 40% inconsistency or less goal for today. The trial inconsistency totals can also be calculated if you want to see an overall score of inconsistency by trial. So that's like at the bottom of each trial's column. You can calculate that. And you can also calculate an overall percent accuracy for the whole session by counting the total number of trials out of 50 that were produced accurately. An example of what this data looks like is on the next slide, so let's dive into that. So I find this example can be a little overwhelming. There is a lot of data, but we'll jump into it, we'll do an explanation, and hopefully it'll make a little more sense. So Recall for this mock session, like I said, the goal was to have an inconsistency score of 40% or less. So you can see that in the very top right, it says accuracy for 5 trials, less than or equal to 40% inconsistency met. So you're counting any trials where 40% or less inconsistency was found. Those are the trials that they have successfully met that inconsistency percentage. Overall, we want our client's inconsistency score to be decreasing over time, and this client's particular goal, like we said, was to achieve remediation down to 20% with 90% accuracy. But in this example, we're going to be working on their first objective, not that overall goal, and that objective was an inconsistency score of 40% or less as a marker of success for a trial. So let's get started with the first target word. We'll use that in this example. That word is sister in the top left there, and we'll look at the data for its production. So across the 5 trials, with each one having 10 productions, the client produced the word sister with an inconsistency score of 40% or less for every trial except trial 1. So you can see in trial 1, they had 5 inconsistent attempts out of 10. That gave them an inconsistency score of 50%, which is not at our 40% or below goal of inconsistency. So they had 1 trial where they were not successful. Because the client's goal was to have 40% or less inconsistent productions, that means that trials 2 through 5 are considered successful because their inconsistency score was either 40% or less than that. So now we can look to that far right column, and that gives the client an 80% accuracy for this word because 4 out of their 5 trials were produced with 40% inconsistency or less. So this client has an 80% accuracy in their production of sister at 40% or less inconsistency. And that is essentially how you read all of this data. And it is also possible to calculate the percent inconsistency of the total productions for sister. So if you wanted to know what is this client's percent inconsistency for this word sister for this session, you would just count up all of their inconsistent productions and take that as a total out of 50, because that's how many times they said the word during the session, and that would be their percent inconsistency for that word overall. Now, if you take a look at the bottom of the table, here is a summary. That bottom row is a summary of data by trial and then an overall accuracy score for the session. So if you take a look at trial 1, that first column, you can see that inconsistent productions for each word in this trial were added together, and then a total number of 39 inconsistent productions were counted out of 100 attempts. So each word was produced 10 times, counted how many were produced inconsistently in column 1, and out of the 100 productions of those 10 words, only 39 were inconsistent. So it is a 39% inconsistency score for trial 1. And then similar calculations were conducted to determine the overall inconsistency scores for trials 2 through 5. So all those percentages on the bottom were found the same way. Then in the very bottom right corner, there's an overall accuracy for the session that was calculated. And this was calculated by the number of word production attempts for which the client was successful or successfully had 40% or less inconsistent productions. Those were the ones that were counted. So we look back to each one of the production attempts and we count 41 attempts where their inconsistency score was less than or equal to 40%. So out of the 50 attempts that the client made, 41 of them were at 40% or less inconsistency. And so a score of 41 out of 50 gives the client an 82% accuracy score for this session. Overall, this process of gathering data is really, really useful because the SLP can obtain extensive information about the client's inconsistency of production, and it can be looked at across word, across trials, and for the session overall. So this looks a little chaotic, it might be a little hard to understand, but there's so much data here that can be used to assess how consistently the client is producing one word, or how consistently the client is producing words in their first trial of the session, or overall, what does the client's session inconsistency look like? What is their accuracy for this session overall? So it's really, really valuable to have all of this data. So how do we support success for a client with this kind of intervention? In order to support their success, the SLP needs to ensure that they are teaching production of target words in a formation that is achievable for the client. It might be necessary, like it was in Ben's case from the research article, to simplify or modify some of the words on the list initially so that the client is able to achieve consistent productions. It's important to remember that consistency is the driving factor in this intervention, and the client is best supported if the SLP is providing target words that they are able to actually produce repeatedly and consistently. The SLP can also support success by ensuring that they are flexible in their strategies for teaching the client the production of a word, whether that's through sensory feedback, position descriptions, demonstration of the production, or another method. It's important that the SLP be able to adjust and use the strategy that is most helpful for the client to understand how to produce that target word. Lastly, clients can be supported by providing prompt and accurate feedback for every inconsistent production of a target word that the client makes. This is essential to core vocabulary approach because it ensures that the client recognizes they've made a different production that is not their best production that's been established, and it gives them an opportunity to self-correct. Feedback in the moment ensures that no incorrect habits are formed during the drilling of target words, and consistent productions are what's being targeted. Okay, last but not least, let's go over some local, international, and virtual resources for speech sound disorders in general and for the core vocabulary approach. So to begin, one of the local resources for where I'm located in Chicago is the Chicago Speech Therapy Practice. So this practice is run by Karen George. She is a licensed SLP and owner of the practice. And this practice allows you to schedule in-person appointments specifically to evaluate if your child or you have a speech sound disorder. But even more importantly, this resource is valuable because the website provides tons of resources that are really, really helpful for parents of children with speech sound disorders. So they break down developmental milestones. They have lots of resources for language activities to do at home with your kids to practice their word production, and they share publications that are relevant to parents of children with speech sound disorders. And all of that can be found on the For Parents tab of her website, and the website URL is shared there, as well as the phone number. So she's got tons and tons of information to support parents of children with speech sound disorders. Another local resource is the Northwestern University Center for Audiology, Speech, Language, and Learning. And just like the previous resource, this location also does in-person appointments, of course, and they evaluate children with speech sound disorders. But even more than that, their website is really, really useful because it provides lots of detailed information for parents about speech sound disorders, what types of speech sound disorders there are, what the possible causes are, what the treatments could be. So it really breaks down for parents looking for more information from a local resource, somewhere that they can go and learn more in person and virtually about their child's disorder. There's tons of information, and that can be found on their website under services and then speech sound disorders. And their website, phone number, and contact email are listed there as well. For some virtual and international resources, one that we have is the Integrated Treatment Services, which is a website and a company that you can contact that provides some basic information for parents about specifically the core vocabulary approach. And really interestingly and really valuably, it tells parents, one, how to prepare before the session. So what do they need to do to get themselves and their child ready for a session that uses core vocabulary approach? And two, what to expect from that session, what to expect to happen during the session, what to expect as results from the intervention. So it really gives a lot of valuable detail about specifically the core vocabulary approach. So you can look on their website, which is listed there below, but this company also does free phone consultations. So their phone number is provided. You can call and speak with them about your child's disorder and interventions and questions that you might have, and they can also be reached at the email shared as well. And lastly, an international resource that we have is Caroline Bowen. So Caroline Bowen has a PhD in speech language pathology, and she's also an author. And on her website, she gives a really, really detailed and valuable explanation of the core vocabulary approach. She talks about the research behind the approach, the rationale for the use of the intervention, the procedures for how it's implemented. She gives tons of information to parents about exactly what the approach is, why it's used, and why it's valuable. Not only that, she also gives an example of what a core vocabulary set looks like, so parents can see what might it look like when they bring their child to therapy and they're asked to make a set of words. She gives a really great example of what that looks like as well. And all of that information can be accessed on her website, which is shared there, and she can also be contacted via her email and her phone number. Okay, that concludes my presentation on the core vocabulary approach as a treatment for inconsistent speech disorder, and here are all of my references for the information that I've shared with you today. Thanks so much for listening.